Some of you who are as old as I am may recall that during the Cold War, this constituted the Iron Curtain that divided Europe for half a century. The Russian perspective is that bringing Ukraine into NATO or the EU pushes the West's military front up against Russia's borders. And that is unacceptable under this regime. Perhaps if a more liberal regime were to take power in the future, that would change. So this is now effectively the Iron Curtain for the Russians. And any Western crossing of that threshold will be met back very aggressively. A large part of Russia's control over Europe, however, is not just political, but it's economic. This is a grid of energy pipelines going only through Ukraine. Oil and natural gas flowing into Europe, controlled by Russia. And Russia has demonstrated on several occasions in the last half-decade its ability and its willingness to turn off the tap, where necessary, to punish countries that are either defying Russia politically or economically. And for the most part, it's been Ukraine that has suffered this. This gives you a much richer sense of the extent of the Russian-controlled energy pipelines deep into Europe. So if you're watching the news one day and you're wondering why the Europeans have a hard time demonstrating the kind of resolve that's necessary to send a strong signal back to Russia, think about this map and think about what would happen to European economies and European societies if the Russians decided to use their control over energy supplies into Europe to send their own message back. And one other area that maybe I'm going too far here, but is going to be an area of concern, is a little-known chunk of Russian territory right in the heart of Europe. So most of us think of Russia back here behind Belarus and Ukraine, but Kaliningrad here is a heavily militarized, heavily fortified region. It could be used as a base for the Russians to cause considerable trouble in the NATO alliance. And, you know, we're here in beautiful California, and most of us don't even know that these three tiny little Baltic countries are in the NATO alliance. We also don't think about the fact that the United States is legally obligated to come to the defense of these tiny little countries in the NATO alliance against Russia if Russia decides to intervene militarily there in some way or another. How many people here in Beverly Hills really want to think about the possibility of very serious conflict between the US and Russia because the Russians decide to assert themselves in these tiny countries? Politically, this is going to be a very, very uncertain situation if the Russians ever want to test an American president's resolve. The Arctic, it's not just polar bears, folks. It's ships, it's shipping, it's global trade and commerce, and increasingly, it's energy reserves. There are some energy engineers who believe that as much as a quarter of the world's untapped reserves of oil and natural gas are underneath or immediately adjacent to the Arctic basin. The Russians have already begun to move in to assert as much sovereignty as possible and to have military forces available by posting these red dots over here. You'll see where they're posting military facilities all around the Arctic. And very importantly for shipping through the Arctic, the Russians have a fleet of about 42 icebreakers. Some of the newer ones are actually nuclear powered and large enough and powerful enough to smash through about 13 feet of ice where necessary to escort ships through the Arctic Ocean. The United States has 2 icebreakers. So the Russians have 40, or 42, somewhere in there. We have 2. And right now, the administration has called for a budgeting that allows for 2 new icebreakers to come into the US fleet, and maybe they'll be online by 2020 or 2022.